Okay. Okay, welcome to the final session on Provably Secure Symmetric Constructions. We have two more presentations. And the first one is when messages are keys. Given
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Welcome everyone to this talk, in which we will be exploring the PRF security of HMAC if you have to swap the key and message inputs. And if you attended Google Project's distinguished lecture earlier this week, you already heard him talk about HMAC and also about how proof-of cryptographic primitives should evolve organically together with the cryptic. And this work is an example of that for HMAC. And this is work together with Provably, Felix Günther, and Svetla. So first of all, what is HMAC? Well, HMAC is a hash-based MAC that was designed by Provably Secure and presented at Crypto in 1996. And it's kind of the Swiss Army knife of cryptography. Indeed, it's been standardized by both the IETF and NIST, and it's analyzed in Provably Secure as a PRF, which means that it can also be used as a MAC and as a key during function. And it forms the basis, for example, of HKD expanding strategy. So it's a very versatile primitive, but more importantly, it's widely used in cryptographic protocols, including in SSH, IPsec, TLS, and WireGuard, to name a few. And more recently, it's also found used in the post-quantum setting, protocols such as ChemTLS, post-quantum WireGuard, and post-TLS. And in cryptographic protocols, HMAC is often used as a key combiner. For example, to combine post-quantum classical keys. And it's in this use as a combiner of cryptographic secrets that the assumption that HMAC is a dual PRF often shows up. So to understand what this means, let's have a look at an example of HMAC connection. And for this example, I'm going to use a high-level overview of the TLS key schedule. But first, let's have a look at HMAC. So mathematically speaking, HMAC is a function which takes as input two arbitrary strings, usually referred to as the key and the message, to return some base output. And by the way, note here that both keys and messages are allowed to be of arbitrary length. So many of you might think of HMAC as having fixed length keys, but actually the standard allows keys of any length, and we'll come back to this later. But for now, let's have a look at TLS. So I'll be using this figure to illustrate HMAC with the first input, which is normally the key, on the left, and the second input, which is the message in standard usage, coming in from the top. And these colors are going to indicate the various secrets in the schedule. So in a late stage of the TLS key schedule, HMAC is used in HKD expand to derive multiple session tickets, here in blue, from some previously derived master secret in red. And as you can see, the master secret is coming in from the left, so into the normal key input space of HMAC. So this means that HMAC is being used in the normal case, and the assumption being made is that this is PRF. But earlier in the key schedule, HMAC is used on input secrets. And as you can see here, the secrets are now coming in from the top, so the message input of HMAC. And this might look a little strange. You might wonder, like, why would anyone put messages into the, keys into the message input of PRF? So the reason here is that these input secrets don't need to be uniform keys. So for example, it can be a family, in which case HMAC is being used in HKD extractor. Now in other settings, this input secret would actually be a uniform key. So for example, in PHI key mode, the first one is a PHI key. And in ChemTLS, the second one is a chem secret derived from encapsulation. So in these cases, HMAC is being used with uniform keys coming into the message input. So it's in a swap setting, and the assumption being made is that it is a swap PRF. Now, if this assumption holds, then the output from the first invocation of HMAC here is going to be a uniform key, which means that we now have it coming into a normal key input of HMAC, the second invocation. So we can again assume that HMAC here is PRF. And it's this combination of PRF and Swap-PRF security that we refer to as dual PRF security. That is, dual PRF security means that HMAC is assumed to be secure both when keyed manually with the first input, as well as in the swap setting with the keyed messaging. And the assumption that HMAC is a dual PRF shows up in the analysis of a myriad of cryptographic protocols, including, as we just saw in the analysis of TLS key mode, where the assumption is made to show key exchange security of the handshake. Further examples include ChemTLS, post-quantum WireGuard, post-quantum noise, as well as the recently standardized messaging layer security. So all of these analyses assume the dual PRF security of HMAC or Swap-PRF security in their theorems and analysis. So clearly, it's an interesting question to know whether HMAC actually is a dual PRF. Now, the starting point for this work is the observation that, surprisingly, this is never previously shown. So to answer this question, we need to have a look inside of HMAC. And many of you might recognize HMAC like this. Here, H is a hash function, such as usually a Merkle-Downward construction, such as SHA-2. And iPad and OPAD are fixed B-bit constants, where B is the block length of the compression function underlying the hash function. Now, this formula for HMAC is accurate if the key is exactly one block long. So for now, we're told though that the standard HMAC is standardized actually allows keys of any length. But for now, we're going to assume that the key is block length, and we'll call this version of HMAC that takes block length keys HMAC B. So having a look inside of HMAC B, starting with the inner implication of the hash function, what happens here is that first the block length key is XORed together with iPad and then fed into a compression function, which in SHA-2 is Davis-Meyer construction, together with an initial vector IV. Then, following the Merkle-Downward transform, the message with some added padding and length encoding is split into blocks and fed into a cascade of calls. Now, looking at the outer implication of the hash function, what happens here is that the block length key is again XORed, this time with OPAD, and fed into the compression function with the IV. This is then combined with the padded output of the upper layer cascade in a final invocation of the compression function. So the only thing that's missing now to go from HMAC B to the full HMAC is to take arbitrary length keys rather than block length keys. So for this, HMAC internally uses a function which we call the pad or hash function. And the way this function works is that, well, it takes its input an arbitrary length string and then outputs a block length string. And if the input is shorter than B bits, then it zero pads it to block length. And if the input is longer than B bits, then what it does is it first hashes it down and then pads it. So now we can replace these assumed block length keys with pad or hash on an arbitrary length key, and we've arrived at the full HMAC. So coming back to the original question, is HMAC a dual PRF? Well, recall that this means that HMAC should be both a PRF and a Swap-PRF. So what does that mean in this setting? Well, let's forget about the internals of HMAC for a moment and think of it as a black box function of two inputs. And since we're going to be in the setting now where keys are messages and vice versa, I replaced K and M by X and Y. So in the PRF setting, X is going to be sampled from their random from the first image space and kept secret, whereas Y is controlled by the adversary. And the task of the adversary is to distinguish the output of HMAC on X and Y from some uniform random string in the output space. And in the Swap-PRF setting, the roles of Y, X, and Y are swapped. So now Y is going to be sampled from their random and kept secret, and X is controlled by the adversary. But the task of the adversary remains the same. So what do we know about the PRF and Swap-PRF security of HMAC? Well, prior proofs have already given us good results in the PRF security of HMAC. So for now, let's focus on the Swap-PRF security, which previously to this work had not been fully studied. So to answer the question of whether HMAC is a Swap-PRF, we need to bring back the details of HMAC. And it turns out that because of the conditions in the pad or hash function, there are actually simple attacks which break the Swap-PRF security of HMAC. Namely, if you make one query that consists of 0, 0, and then a second query consisting of 2 zeros, then these will both be pad or hash to a full block of zeros. So when you make these two queries, HMAC internally will have the same input, which means that the output in the real world is going to be the same. And this is easy to distinguish from the random world, where with high probability, the output is only state varies between states. So HMAC is not a Swap-PRF. And this is a problem because it immediately invalidates the general assumption that HMAC is a dual PRF, which was made in the analysis of all of these information protocols. But what about the other side? At least HMAC is a PRF, right? Well, so recall that I said that prior work has already given us good results in PRF security of HMAC. Now it turns out that these prior proofs are actually not for full HMAC, but only for HMAC-B. So that is, they assume that the key is multiplying. And this means that the pattern hash function is not applied. However, in practice, the keys used to HMAC are actually barely good. So if you take HMAC and instantiate it, for example, with SHA-256, then the output length is going to be 256 bits, and the block length is 512 bits. So note that the output length C here of HMAC is shorter than the block length. And this is generally the case. So coming back to our TLS example, these red derived keys, which are the outputs of HMAC, will be 256 bits. But as you can see, they're being used directly as keys to the next implementation of HMAC, which we now know internally expects a block length key that is 512 bits. So this means that the pattern hash function is going to be applied there. Hence, it's actually insufficient to have PRF security of HMAC, since in practice, HMAC is often being used with keys that are shorter. So we know now that HMAC is not a Swap-PRF, and now it's PRF security is also out. What does this mean for the analysis of all of the protocols that assumes the dual PRF security of HMAC? Well, this question is what we set out to answer in this work. And we show that HMAC is a variable key length PRF, where VKL PRF security is a new notion that we introduced, which takes care of the variable length keys that use the practice. So recall that as an example, in the PRF setting, I said that X is going to be sampled from a random. Now the mathematicians in the room might wonder, what does it even mean to sample from a random set? If so, very good question. So in variable key length PRF security, we take care of this by letting the adversary control the length of the key. So the notion is in a multi-user setting, and each time the adversary requests a key, we can adaptively specify the length of that key. So coming to our contributions, in the PRF setting, we bridge the gap between HMAC-B and HMAC and show that HMAC is a variable key-length PRF. And we do this with good user bounds, meaning that the bound does not degrade in the number of users. And the proof uses only standard mode assumptions all the way down to the function. So looking at the assumptions that we need, they're similar to those used in prior proofs for HMAC-B, namely that the compression function is a PRF, that it is a Swap-PRF, as well as that the compression function is a Swap-PRF under related key attacks. And here we need a slightly broader class of related key derived functions compared to prior work, but we validate this assumption in the ideal segment. So let's have a brief look at how the proof works. So following prior work on HMAC-B, we start by modularizing HMAC to two components, NMAC and a function that we call HSKD, or HMAC subkey derivation function, which takes care of the pattern hashing on X, as well as the X or the I pattern of pattern. Then we show that HMAC, which is the composition of these two, is a variable key length PRF, if NMAC is a PRF, and if the subkey derivation function is a variable C length PRG. And this is also a new notion that we introduced, but it works just like PRG security, except that the adversary can now control the length of the C to the generator. So then we go on to show these two conditions. And prior work has already shown that NMAC is PRF, and our contribution here is to give a new proof which achieves good user bounds. And then we show that the subkey derivation function is a variable C length PRG. And since this is new, let's have a brief look at how it works. So focusing on the subkey derivation function, the output of HSKD is defined to be the concatenation of the inner layer output Xi and the outer layer output XO. And recall that we're in the PRF setting of HMAC here. So X is going to be sampled uniformly random with the length chosen by the adversary. Now the goal of variable C length PRG security is to show that the output is distinguishable from random. So to do this, we're going to reduce to the Swap-PRF security of the compression function under related key attacks. And we need to be in the swap setting here because the key material X is coming in from the top, which is the message input to the compression function. And the related key attack assumption is going to take care of the matter hashing the X like and a notepad. So simplified, you can think of the proof as first applying an early key deriving function to replace these two functions of X with two related keys. And then, assuming that the compression function is a Swap-PRF setting, the output will be in the signature random. And so we've achieved our goal. Now, you might ask how reasonable this assumption on the compression function is. And to answer this, we need to have a look inside. So recall that the compression function is a Davis-Meyer construction, which means that internally it has a block cipher sort of flipped over on the side. So somewhat surprisingly, being in the swap setting actually helps us here, because the key material is now coming in directly into the key input of the block cipher. So this means that we can directly reduce the RKA Swap-PRF security in the compression function to the PRP security of the block cipher under related key attacks. And we validate this assumption with the ideal cipher. So bubbling back up to our contributions in the Swap-PRF setting, you know from the attack we saw earlier that we cannot get Swap-PRF security of HMAC in general because of the collisions in the data hash function. So in our work, we fully characterize the input sets for which you can get Swap-PRF security, and we call these feasible. And there are two classes of feasible sets. The first is the class of all sets that contain only fixed like short strings. So that means any set of strings that have a fixed length whose length is shorter than equal to the block length. The second class is the class of sets of only long inputs. So that means the set of any length strings as long as the length is small. In our paper, we give proofs and attacks to show that we get Swap-PRF security for swap HMAC if and only if the inputs are in one of these two feasible sets. So luckily for the analysis of the protocols that assumes the dual PRF security of HMAC, the keys or inputs to swap HMAC, when HMAC is used in practice, actually falls into the first of these two classes. And in general, the feasible sets cover the practical usage of HMAC. So that means that when we need it, we do have Swap-PRF security of HMAC. So let's have a brief look at how this proof works. Oh, sorry, the assumptions first. So the assumptions here are similar to those for HMAC, namely that H is a PRF, and again that the compression function is a Swap-PRF under related key attacks, now for a slightly different class of related key derived functions. Additionally, we need that the compression function is collision resistant, and that the messaging is RNA in the sets to avoid attacks from collisions. So now let's have a look at it. So as before, we start by modularizing swapped HMAC into two components, this time swapped NMAC and the subkey derivation function, characterized by the set of feasible inputs. Then we show that the composition is a variable key length PRF if swapped NMAC is a variable length PRF, and if the subkey derivation function is collision resistant. And as before, we then go on to show these two conditions. And since we already talked about why the subkey derivation function needs to be collision resistant to avoid the attacks we saw earlier, let's focus briefly on the variable key length PRF security swap NMAC. So here we're in the swap setting, which means that Y is now going to be the secret values are completely random. And the goal in variable key length PRF security is again to show that the output is indistinguishable from random. So now we're again going to use the assumption that the compression function is a Swap-PRF under related key attacks applied to the first invocation of the compression function. So again, we're in the swap setting because the key material is coming into the top of the compression function. And this time, the related key assumption takes care of the padding that's potentially applied to the. Now, if this assumption holds, then the output will be indistinguishable from random, which means that we now have some uniformly random thing coming into the key input in the next invocation function. So we can apply PRF security throughout the cascade and replace the output of the underlying cascade by a uniform random string. Then, applying the related key assumption again to care of the padding, we can again assume that the compression function is a Swap-PRF under related key attacks, and then we achieve our goal. So in case you zoomed out during all these brief details, now's a good time to wake up because we're about to finally answer the question of whether HMAC is a doomed PRF. And the long answer is, well, it's complicated. But in practice, you could say that, yes, HMAC is a dual PRF, as long as you accept the terms and conditions, which in this case are that PRF now means variable key-length PRF, and that the inputs must be increased in the second. You can find the details in our paper, which is on ePrint. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. You have the effective choice of lengths of the key, but it's like there can be multiple kinds of different key lengths inputs you can study distinct.
What's that?
You can acquire for key length input 0, but you get 0 input length 1, and 1 to 6 is equal to the first one, you get collisions from the functions to 1.
So it's a very good observation that, of course, if you have very, very short keys, zero-length keys, then you cannot get security. So, of course, like this was highly simplified. The way the definition or the proofs rather work in the paper is that we have this resource of the adversary called the minimum key length. So the proof or the bounds depend on the minimal like key that the adversary requires.
I see.
I'm not sure if I follow the question.
Don't worry, the effect control the message will be
Yep.
The message, the effect controls the and the message controls the
It's a question of words, I think, because what it controls is the second, like the first input to HMAC, which is usually referred to as the key, right? But in the setting, the key is actually in the second input to HMAC.
right. But if I control the first indicator, which might most trivially seem
Yes, yeah.
so how can we
So we show that it's a PRF in that setting when the inputs are restricted to these feasible sets. So either all of the inputs are.
I wouldn't want to. Okay, thank you very much.
I mean, luckily, it actually covers the practical usage of swap HMAC. So, but it's you're right. It's not a dual PRF without any restrictions. Here, we're analyzing HMAC because it is what is used in practice, not to propose it.
There's one question from chat as well. Here, HMAC is a swap-PRF secure if keys are restricted to sets satisfying the condition for feasibility. How does it affect the reduction of key space? The reduction of key space.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think normally we think of PRFs as having fixed length keys. So most of the classes would support any fixed length keys, which means that any sort of normal key set would be covered by that. Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question.
Do you want to be the game or?
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Thank you again. Layout graphs on the box and the key present dependency is being examples. Represent right numbers and numbers.
Want to say? Okay, thank you all for being here. It's the last talk, so I appreciate this. Thank you. So my name is Angelos, and I'll talk about our work with and then Stefan and Binold, Stefan is right there, on layout graphs, random walks, the QI's independence of SPN block ciphers. And so the motivating question behind this work was whether AS is secure. And I don't think I need to explain why this is an important question. In cryptography, AS is used everywhere all the time. Let me start the talk by answering two questions. What is AS and how we think about it for this talk? And what does it mean to be secure? So let me first introduce a framework for designing block ciphers, or more generally, key permutations on bits, called the key alternating cipher. So we have an n-bit input. We XOR it with a secret key that's also n bits. Here it's denoted K0. And then we apply a fixed public permutation pi, and we repeat this for a number of rounds. And so a specific instantiation of the key alternating cipher is called a substitution permutation network, which gives you a specific recipe for defining the fixed permutation pi. And it goes as follows. Instead of defining a big fixed permutation pi, you split your input into k blocks of 8 bits. And now you apply the smaller permutation S to each block separately. This is also called the S blocks. And then you apply a big linear mixing to all of the blocks together. So when you put everything together, an SPN looks as follows. And so the parameters that define an SPN is the length of the input, the number of blocks, the size of each block, the S box permutation, the number of rounds, and the linear mixing. And so for this talk, we think of AS as an SPN that has 128 bits. It divides them into 16 blocks of 8 bits each. It goes for 10, 12, or 14 rounds. Remember this number. The S box is the inverse over the field, and the linear mixing comprises of the shift rows and mixed columns of permission. So now what does it mean to be secure? As cryptographers, we like to think of pseudorandom permutations, which has the following security game. We have the adversary that interacts with a permutation that's either AS with a random key in the real world, but ideally we would like it to be a truly random permutation. And we want to say that if you are allowed polynomial many queries, you shouldn't be able to distinguish the world you live in with more than negligible advantage in points. So we don't know how to do this for block ciphers because we don't have good candidate reductions to harness conjecture. So prior work and our work consider two-wise independence, in which the security game is very similar, but now we only allow the adversary to make T non-adaptive queries to the black box that has a permutation, but is now given unbounded time to distinguish, and it still shouldn't be able to distinguish with more than negligible advantage. Formally, T-wise independence says that for any T inputs, x1 up to xt, the corresponding outputs are very close to unity. And what's nice about T-wise independence is that it already covers attacks that have been successful in breaking block ciphers in the past. But I should say here that T-wise independence is not the goal, it's just the lens through which we study security. This is because we already know efficient and good constructions for T-wise independence permutations through polynomials, but they're not pseudorandom, right? They're T-wise, but they're not T+1-wise. So what we do here is we study block ciphers as an actual construction that's probably T-wise and plausibly pseudorandom. Additionally, T-wise independence is feasible potentially conditionally for a long enough key. And for this talk, we assume independent round keys to satisfy this. And that's a pretty standard assumption. Okay, some prelinks. So prior work by my co-authors that was presented in Q2 in 2021 gave a bunch of good results on SPNs. For example, they showed that 2 rounds of SPN is roughly close to pairwise, and 3 rounds is square root of k over 2 to the d close to pairwise. So these results only hold if the linear mixing satisfies some conditions that are not very important now. And unfortunately, AS doesn't satisfy these conditions. So they had an additional AS result where they showed that 6 rounds of AS is 0.42 close to pairwise independent. When I say pairwise, I mean 2 inputs, 2 outputs, we shouldn't be able to distinguish. Right? And then they use an amplification lemma, which shows how the distance decreases. And the conclusion is that 9,000 rounds of AS is close to pairwise. So who remembers the number of rounds? It's 10, 12, or 14. So, okay, 9,000 rounds is 1,000. So this is the motivating question why we started looking at this question. How low can we get 9,000 rounds to? By the way, I made fun, but it's not that we reached 10 or 14, but we'll see what's the number we reach. Okay, so to tackle this question, we consider first an idealized model that was introduced in 2006 called an SPN star. And the difference now is that instead of having a fixed S-box permutation, that's the inverse, we randomize the S-boxes. How does that look like? We start with an SPN, as it is. We replace all of the S-boxes with random permutations, a different one per round and per block. And these permutations are also now secret. And note that since they're secret, they're part of the secret key, and even more because they're random permutations, we can swallow the key inside the S-box. So we can even skip the XOR of the random key. So SPN star looks pretty nice. It just alternates random S-box and linear mixed units. So let me first say a bit about the usefulness of this model. First, we already have block ciphers with random secret S-boxes. Second, we give a way to translate random S-box results to non-random S-box results. This is through something we call the censored SPN. And it relies on this lemma. We prove that if you alternate XORing the round key with the inverse S-box, it approximates a random permutation. Finally, since we're idealizing the S-box, this allows us to kind of hone in on the mixing and see what we need from the mixing for it to be a good block cipher. For example, our proofs require the maximal branching number of the mixing layer. And additionally, we also get tight bounds that show us how different parameters affect convergence. For example, as the number of rounds increases, we get better convergence. So this is now finally that there is some line of work on the large S-box model, and we believe that by studying an ideal S-box, a random S-box, we may get some more insight on this line of work as well, since we have to get over some main barrier that they. So let me jump into our results. On the SPN star front, our results are of the form R rounds of SPN star are epsilon close to reach Ty independence. And this is the table. So 2 rounds of SPN star are very close to Ty's constant T. That's the first row. Also, 2 rounds of SPN star are kind of close to Ty's independent for large T. That's the second row. And we use amplification to get that K rounds of SPN star are very close to Ty's independence for large T. And finally, the last row is that log T rounds are very close to Ty's independent for large T. So when I say here large T, I mean T up to roughly square root of 2 to the D, which is actually a limitation of our work, kind of obviously, since there is no good reason why T shouldn't go to the full domain, why T doesn't go all the way up to 2 to the KB. And that's my favorite open question for work. So on the AS front, we also consider replacing the S-boxes with random S-boxes for AS. And there we get that 7 rounds of AS star are very close to pairwise independent. Before you get very happy, that's AS star, it has much more randomness. I should say a lot of progress towards this result was already done with the work that introduced SPN star. However, the result we get is tight, meaning we have numerically verified that 6 rounds of AS star are not close enough to pairwise. And so we can now use the result that we simulate random S-boxes with non-random S-boxes, something that we put here in the censored AS, and I'll talk about in a bit. But the result is that 192 rounds of censored AS are close to pairwise independent. So let me talk to you about this censored SPN kind of thing. I have an SPN star at the top. And so consider the first round of random S-boxes. And we show that we can simulate these with a true SPN, where these S-boxes are the fixed inverse permutation that the AS has. But now we are skipping the linear mixing units. So if we put all of these together, this is how, and this is the lemma we use to show this. And this is how a censored SPN would look like. So here, it's a normal SPN with inverse S-boxes, but we are censoring or skipping some of the linear mixes. So here I have censored the first, the second, the fourth, and the fifth. So again, the result for censored AS is that 192 rounds suffice, I haven't told you how many rounds we fix, but it's a lot. It's more than 3/4, more than 7/8. So we believe that removing almost all of the mixing layers would hurt security. We believe that's a reasonable heuristic. So we consider this evidence that the true AES is also pairwise dependent in less than 200 rounds. And then contrast this with the 9,000 round result of parity. Briefly mentioning some related work. Again, I mentioned SPN star is not new. It was introduced and studied first by Bourgeon and Bourgeon in 2006. I already mentioned the large SBox model, where they use SPNs with large SBoxes, but there the size of the SBox is also a security parameter, which is not the case for us. And finally, recent work by Godis, Pakilian, and Wicks suggests some conjectures that can transfer results from the large SBox to a small SBox regime. So I want to briefly again mention some of the limitations of prior work. There I have put two results from prior work on SPNs and SPN star, and observe that both of them can only get T-wise up to 2 to the B, which is also a limitation of our work. But again, there is no reason to expect that we can't get T up to the 3 by 8. Additionally, see that the results they get worse with the number of blocks. So as the number of blocks K increases, we get worse security. This is counterintuitive, and our bounds do not reflect that. And finally, they have 2 to the B in the denominator. So to get full security, they need to use amplification lemmas, which seems unnatural. Ideally, we'd like to have 2 to the KB in the denominator. Okay, let me jump into the technical details. So we use the notion of a layout. And the observation here is that when we have a random SBox, it basically destroys any correlation between two inputs, except equality. So here, as an example, if we have x1 and x2, and they agree on the ith block, since we apply the same permutation, let's say s2 to them, the outputs y1i and y2i will also agree. Otherwise, if there's a block J on which they disagree, since it's a permutation, it's going to map them to a different value. So the outputs are also going to disagree. And even more, since it's random, they're going to get mapped to completely different values randomly. So the difference delta y of J is going to be a uniformly random non-zero value. So it makes sense to define the layout of two inputs or their difference delta x to be the blocks where they differ. This has been studied also in the past under the activity pattern. And I have argued that random SBoxes preserve the layouts since they map 0 to 0, non-zero to non-zero. And finally, because it's a random SBox, delta y, whenever it's non-zero, it's going to be uniformly random non-zero. So this is an example. If we compute the difference between these two specific inputs, we see that they agree on blocks 0 and 3. And so this is how we write their layout. And the weight is the number of blocks they agree on, so that will be 2. And lower weight means more distinct layouts, which is nice. So for the intuition of the proof, we will think of one round of AS as a walk on this graph, where the nodes are the pairs of the inputs. And then one round is going to randomly take us to another pair. And because it's randomized, it may take us to one of the neighbors randomly. And recall that an SPN round has random SBoxes and a mixing. So let's see how each one behaves separately. And let me also put the layouts in them, which partition the space in pairs. So first, the random SBox, as we saw, it keeps you in the same layout, but it chooses a random node in the layout. So this is how the random SBox is going to act. And then the mixing is fully deterministic. So it's just going to map it to another deterministic value, and it may be outside the layout, maybe inside. So in principle, we can just forget about the things inside the layouts, and we can just consider the layouts on their own, since the random SBox randomizes you fully inside the layout. And this is what we do, and this is what we call the layout graph and the layout walk. This is important, so I'll reiterate once again. We have an SPN star, and we have the inputs, and we see how they change throughout the progression of the SPN star. And random SBoxes preserve the layout. So we have L1 in the beginning, then the linear mixing may change us, but then we're going to get randomized over after the randomized process and so on. So again, we only consider the layouts in the simplified problem. We define the random walk on the layout graph to be a 1, a 2, or 3, and so on. And to get convergence to pairwise independence, it suffices to bound the mixing time on this layout. So the first step is to understand how the mixing affects the layout, since it's the one that doesn't deserve it. This is what we call the layout transition probability. And I guess the case we're considering here is that we have a layout die on the left, and we want to see where it's going to take us on the right. Delta y is a random input difference from the layout. And so we can compute m times delta y is delta x. And the question is, what's the probability that it's layout j? And it depends on the mixing matrix. And that's why we make the assumption on the mixing matrix. And we write the quantity that we care about as what's the probability that we go from layout I to layout j. So I'll skip most of the math, but trust me, it's good math. Okay, so what's nice is that we get an estimation for this probability that's the sum of these two terms. The really nice thing is that the red quantity is exactly the stationary probability of the layout. So that's exactly what you want to get. The blue quantity is the error. And it turns out that the error is smaller if the weight of the layout is small. So that gives us the lemma. If we start from a layout with a small weight, then your next layout is going to be very close to the stationary distribution that you have. And so this basically writes the proof itself. If the first layout you have has low weight, then the second layout is close to stationary success. If the first layout is not low weight, then we show that the second layout is going to be low weight with good probability, thus the third layout is going to be close to stationary. And this can be generalized to T-wise with a bit more pain, but the idea is. So I can leave you with some open questions. If you like T-wise independence like I do, then we don't know how to prove it, at least I don't know, how to prove the T-wise independence of any non-idealized block cipher for T1 and 2. So 3-wise independence of AS, we don't know. Can we get an improved AS analysis? We gave 192 rounds. I mean, A is heuristic because it's censored AS. So can we formally prove that AS is at least secure? And B, can we get the 192 to of T10? Finally, my favorite question is this T up to 2 to the B we get for SPN star is really unnatural to me. So can we get it all the way up to the full domain? No. And can we prove the T-wise independence of SPNs in rounds? And we have a bunch of block cipher questions as well about key scheduling, other classes of attacks, and security against the queries. And I guess I put a bunch of words here for our program goal that's about studying block cipher attacks from a theoretical perspective. And what's nice is that reduction techniques are not very useful, so we may need more tools for math. So that makes this thing. Thank you.
Have the assumption that the line mixing doesn't need the result extend.
Yeah. So we do have results that extend. I don't know if they're formally written, but most of the results extend to when your branching number is not optimal, but you get worse bounds. And I mean, AS doesn't achieve the maximum branching number. So
Questions? All the speakers in the session. So I guess concludes